After the additions the Orioles have made to their rotation heading into this year, the biggest question for that group might be, what is Cade Povich's role? We'll look back at his first year with the Orioles and try to answer that question. Coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Thursday, January 16th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we are going to continue our Orioles 2024 player season review series. We're getting near the end, but today we are going to talk about Cade Povich. His first year in the big leagues was 2024. Some went well, some not so well, and there's a big question for Povich heading into next year, which is what in the world is his role, at least to start the year, with this Orioles team. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. So I know there was some international signing news, names announced on Wednesday. Just a little peek behind the curtain. I am recording this on Tuesday to be posted on Thursday, just the way my schedule worked this week. So because of that, we're not going to get to international signings. Maybe we'll be back Friday, more than likely next week back on the pod. We will talk a bit about some of those international names, most of them 15, 16, 17 years old. Not a lot to be known about some of those guys, but we'll chat through some of the big names that the Orioles went through. Did have another episode earlier this week, though, on Tuesday. Make sure to go back and check that one out. Talked about Roki Sasaki, Jeff Hoffman, John Means, all that good stuff. If you've listened, if you haven't, whether it may be, make sure you leave a 5-star rating and a review wherever you listen to the pod. And of course, if you could like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. That helps out a lot. Today, we are continuing our process of looking through pretty much every player on the Orioles 40-man roster that was with the O's in the 2024 season and doing a review of their campaign. And today, we are going to talk about Cade Povich, who had himself an interesting first season in the big leagues, and we are going to roll through. We'll talk about what went right for Cade Povich this season. We will talk about what went wrong, and then we'll talk about what is his biggest question heading into 2025. And for Povich, it's pretty simple of that. Where's he fit in the rotation after the additions the Orioles have made? But let's start with what went right for Cade Povich in 2024. The 24-year-old left-hander who will be 25 in April, who came over from the Twins in the Jorge Lopez trade at the deadline in 2022. What went right for him? Well, he finally made his major league debut. After coming over to Baltimore, got a taste of AAA at the end of the 2023 season, went back there this year and was really good. Posted a 3.48 ERA in 14 starts, 78 innings at the AAA level. Good strikeout rates down there. He was up at 28%. He was pretty good in the walk category as well, pretty much league average. It was a good combination that allowed him to, when the Orioles needed him, come up to the big leagues. Dean Kramer was put on the IL right at the end of May, and on June 6th, the Orioles finally needed a new starter to replace Kramer in the rotation. They were north of the border in Toronto, and they called up Cade Povich to make his major league debut. Now, it didn't go amazing. He went 5 1/3, allowing 6 earned runs on 5 hits with 2 Ks, 4 walks, and a home run allowed in an Orioles day game loss to the Blue Jays. His fastball was playing well up in the zone. It was getting a lot of pop-ups, a lot of lazy fly balls. He's got that good run on the fastball, that rising action, but his command was all over the place. He walked 4 batters, really didn't have the pinpoint stuff that makes him really, really good if he can have it. And it kind of looked like those first start jitters for him. But he backed it up and he showed that, hey, I was a little shaky here, but I'm ready for the big leagues. Because his very next start, his Camden Yards debut the next week, 6 scoreless innings with 6 Ks and no walks against the Atlanta Braves offense was quite impressive. And he had some other issues here and there, but it was kind of off and running. Now, after that amazing start against the Braves, he had a couple more rocky outings. and he ending up back in AAA at one point, which we'll get to. But another thing that went right for Povich was he was really good in September. Now, his overall stats for the year, he made 16 starts for the Orioles through 79 and 2/3 innings and posted a 5.20 ERA with a 4.79 FIP. That came along with a 35% ground ball rate, a 20% strikeout rate, and about a 10% walk rate for Povich. So not the greatest numbers by any stretch of the imagination. He had a barrel rate that was high, didn't get hit super, super hard, which was good, but it was a fly ball pitcher, which can get you into a little bit of trouble. Didn't get a lot of swing and miss, didn't get a lot of chase. It wasn't the greatest profile that you're looking at, but September was really, really good. And if you compare the rest of his outings to just the September version of Cade Povich, well, that's the pitcher the Orioles hope he's building on and can become in 2025. Because Povich was just a regular member of the five-man rotation for the entire month of September. The O's had injuries, they had inconsistencies, and he just settled into one of those five spots. And he made 5 starts in September through 27 and 2/3 innings and posted a 2.80 ERA with 32 strikeouts to just 8 walks in that stretch, and included the best start of his career so far. Now, granted, big grain of salt, it did come against the 2024 Chicago White Sox, but still, when you go 7 1/3 scoreless, 5 hits, 10 Ks, and no walks against any big league ball club, that is very, very impressive. And really in September was his sweeper was outstanding. For Cade Povich, it's a 6-pitch mix, 4-seam fastball, curveball, sweeper, changeup, sinker, and cutter. We saw him throw all 6 of them at times in the big leagues this year. The 4-seamer at 92, it's 41% usage. Every other pitch he threw 20% or less and kind of mixed and matched those other offerings as the year went on. But the sweeper was that number one out pitch against lefties. They swung and missed 36% of the time. And that's the money pitch. It's got the best stuff plus numbers. It's got the best movement of anything he throws. That can really neutralize lefties. But he also uses that curveball to get righties, because the sweeper from a lefty can be a lot easier for a righty to hit, but a curveball, just a different plane of break, can be tougher for right-handed hitters. And his 4-seamer, which is his bread and butter, is the one he throws a lot to righties. But the curveball he threw almost exclusively to right-handed batters. That was a pitch that really was his number 2 most used offering. It's 76 miles an hour. It's really like a bigger, loopier pitch. And it's not a lot of swing and miss on it, but nobody seemed to square it up this year, which was good. And all of it kind of came together with the curveball, with the sweeper, with better fastball command. And also a lot of it was apparently working with a mental skills coach. He reached out to Brian Kane, who is a mental skills coach who also works with Corbin Burns. I'm assuming that is where Povich got the recommendation. And late in the season, he started pitching under the alter ego of Slim, where he was Cade Povich off the mound. But when he stepped on the rubber, he was not Cade Povich. He was known as Slim. And it seemed to help lock him in more, because he started doing that really at the end of August. And as I said, 5 amazing starts in the month of September, helping the Orioles get to the postseason. And really the last big thing that went well for Povich, besides the great September, again, that he kind of really reined in that command, figured out what stuff works, what didn't in September, was also that there was a plan for the Orioles to use him in the playoffs. And even as good as he was in September, and even the fact that he made 19 starts for the Orioles last year, you don't need more than 3 or 4 starting pitchers in the postseason. I don't think many would have thought Cade Povich would have been one of those, but it seemed like the Orioles were potentially leaning that way. In the wild card round, in the best of 3 series against the Royals, he was somewhat surprisingly placed on that wild card roster. He had previously started the Friday night game in the final series of the year against the Twins. Then they played Saturday, Sunday, had the day off Monday, and then game 1 of the wild card series was Tuesday. So theoretically, Povich could have started game 2 or game 3 and been ready to pitch in either of them in that series, and he was put on the roster, and Albert Suarez was not. If you can remember back to the end of the regular season, it was kind of surprising. The Orioles had Albert Suarez start the final game of the year. The Orioles had nothing to play for. They were locked into their seating, their position, everything in game 162 in Minnesota. Suarez was slated to start, and we knew, like, hey, there's a day off Monday. Corbin Burns is pitching game 1. Zach Eflin's pitching game 2. But Suarez was in the mix to pitch game 3 if necessary. You thought, okay, the Orioles will start him. He'll pitch 1 or 2 innings in this Sunday game, keep his arm loose, and he'll be ready for game 3 if the Orioles need him. Instead, Suarez pitched like 6 innings in that final game of the year, which took him out of being able to be used in any of the potential 3 wildcard games, which was kind of confusing. You were like, okay, I guess the Orioles are going to have Dean Kramer be the number 3 starter, and that may have been the case, but Povich and Kramer were both on the wild card roster, and Suarez was not. And now we never got to know what the Orioles' plan would have been because Burns started game 1, Eflin started game 2. They were both good, but unfortunately, the Orioles' offense did nothing, and they were swept in 2 games by the Royals and never got to a game 3. And we never heard from Brandon Hyde what the plan would have been. You would think it would have been an all-hands-on-deck thing where Kramer or Povich starts. The other one is absolutely available early out of the bullpen, and then your entire relief corps is available as well. But it was just intriguing that the Orioles seemingly at that point trusted Povich more than Suarez, and that's not the greatest bar to clear, but Suarez undoubtedly had a better season than Povich did, but he was so good in September, they seemed to trust him in that role, and I don't think the Orioles want Povich starting a playoff game in 2025. If it comes to that, there's probably been some injury issues, but that shows you the belief they had in him, even in his rookie year. And it's definitely nice to see that. But it wasn't all amazing stuff. Yes, September was good, but again, you see a 5.20 ERA in 16 starts, and you know, okay, some things must have gone poorly as well. We'll talk about what went wrong in Povich's first MLB season coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Game Time. I love going to live events, whether it's sports, music, theater, or comedy. Some of my favorite memories last year were attending Orioles games. The energy and the excitement were unforgettable, and get some of those tickets at Game Time. But now, Game Time has made it even easier to get tickets for your favorite events with their new feature, Game Time Picks. This feature filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Now, recently, actually back last week, I was looking for tickets to Ravens Steelers. Didn't end up going, but I was using the Game Time app, and with Game Time Picks, I found amazing deals and can even see the view from my seat before buying. I got some great deals that I saw on the app. I didn't go because I don't like the cold, and it was freezing on Saturday night. Now, super deal they have are pretty impressive. Plus, the app's all-in pricing shows the total cost up front, no surprise fees at checkout. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB. That is LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. So for Cade Povich, it was a really good finish to his season, but there were some issues as well in his first stint in the big leagues. Again, he had a 5+ ERA in 16 starts. And the first big thing that went wrong was the walks were a huge issue early for Cade Povich. In his first 8 starts with the Orioles, he threw 37 1/3 innings with 25 strikeouts to 23 walks. That's a 14% strikeout rate, way too low, to a 13% walk rate. Remember, league average is around 8. That is way too high. And he had 3 separate starts in those first 8 where he walked 5 batters. He also had 1 with 4 walks and 1 with 3 walks. That is not where you want to be. Now, sometimes he was able to get away with it. There was that start at Yankee Stadium where he allowed just 1 run over 4 2/3 innings, but with 1 strikeout and 5 walks. And he just kept wiggling out of jams somehow in some way against that Yankee offense. However, he wasn't always able to wiggle out of it. There was also some disastrous starts. He walked 5 batters and allowed 6 runs in a start against Toronto. He also had the disastrous outing in Oakland where he didn't record an out in the second inning and allowed 8 earned runs against the A's. That was certainly the worst start of Povich's career so far. Although that start was so bad that if you just take that one out, he had a 4.35 ERA in the other 15 starts he made, which is a lot easier to swallow in your first season. And really because of those walk issues, like the Orioles knew the stuff was there, but you just can't keep getting away with it with all those walks. And because of that, he was optioned back down to AAA on July 13th. So just over a month after he'd been initially called up, he went back to Norfolk. Now, the Orioles brought him back on July 29th just to make a spot start. They needed a starter then, and he walked 5 batters in that one. and then went right back down to AAA again. But the Orioles were clearly working on something. And 2 weeks later, August 13th, he comes to the big leagues again. And that was at the point where he pretty much stuck for good because he seemingly had fixed the walk issues. Now, he had 2 more starts after that in August, and they weren't great. He allowed 5 earned runs in each of them. But the walks pretty much went away in those 2 starts. And you could tell, like, hey, he's so focused on throwing more strikes that it hurt him in the runs department, but you could see things starting to blossom. And finally, you got to September, and it all clicked together with those 5 really good starts that I mentioned. Now, the other real big issue for Povich, and this kind of carried into the walk issues, one of the causes of it, was his cutter was just not very good. Now, this is a pitch he added in 2023 between AA and AAA with the Orioles, and it worked for him down in the minors, and it was working for him some in AAA in 2024 before he got called up, but that thing was a disaster when he got to the major leagues. Opponents this year hit .333 with an .810 slugging percentage against Cade Povich's cutter in the major leagues. So when he came back up on August 13th after being optioned a couple of times, the cutter was gone. In those final, 7 starts of the year, he did not throw a single cutter. And it falls right in line with the timing of finally cutting down on the walks. Those final 8 starts, he really didn't walk people. Those final 8 starts, he really didn't throw the cutter at all. Because, like, you look in July, 35.1% zone rate on the cutter. That is not good. That is like no command of a pitch. So basically, you're looking at a pitch where 2/3 of the time he's throwing it out of the strike zone. Guys are taking it for a ball. And the 1/3 of the time he's throwing it in the strike zone, he seemingly was throwing it right down the middle and it was getting crushed. There were no quality pitches on the corners that he was throwing with that cutter. So while in the minors, that was a pitch that he could jam righties with, get soft contact, get grounders against right-handers, it was just doing nothing for him in the major leagues. And that was a pitch where you're thinking, oh, Connor, he throws 6 pitches. How could just having bad command of the cutter lead to all of these walk issues? It wasn't just the cutter. He had some poor command of some of his other offerings as well. He was spraying the fastball for a while, and that's his main pitch. But early in the year, he was throwing the cutter more than 15% of the time. Like, that's a serious slice of your pitches. And if you're throwing a pitch 15% of the time, and basically every time you throw it, you have no idea where it's going, that is going to hurt your command significantly. So if you chop off that entire 15%, which is what he did, and instead he upped the usage of his sweeper and his curveball, his 2 really good breaking pitches, which he has much, much better command of, and really always did have better command of, the walk rate started going down. And because those pitches are just better than his cutter and shape and stuff and all that good stuff, he got better in terms of allowing less runs. And it all came together in September. And even without the cutter, it's still a 5-pitch mix. Like, you're still getting that 4-seam fastball at 92 with the good ride, gets a lot of lazy pop-ups and fly balls. The big curveball, he can throw to righties. He can drop it in for a called strike. He's got that big sweeper that lefties basically can't hit. And then he throws the sinker, not nearly as much as his 4-seam fastball, but he throws the sinker. He can throw it inside the lefties to keep them honest. He can try to hit it on the corners against righties at times. And then that changeup, when he got rid of the cutter, that changeup replaced the cutter as the thing he was trying to weaponize against right-handed hitters. It was really good in that 10 strikeout outing against the White Sox. Like, he'd throw the changeup to the outside corner against a righty. It would dive outside, and a righty would chase it and be ahead of it every single time. It was like watching John Means at times when that changeup was on. Now, it's not his best pitch. It still needs some work. But when it's on, he can be really, really nasty. And you look at it, it's like, yeah, you added that cutter and it helped you in the minors. But if it's not helping you in the majors and you have 6 pitches, if you can ditch a cutter and still have 5 pitches at the major league level, like, you're good. So I don't really think he's going to miss the cutter. Maybe he tweaks it and brings it back in 2025. That's a possibility. But it really doesn't feel like he needs it in his repertoire with how bad it was this season. So we went through what worked, what didn't. So what's his role for 2025? That's the big Cade Povich question. We'll try to answer it to finish off the show coming up next. So for Cade Povich, when we began the offseason, I had him slated in as the Orioles' number 5 starter. Even at times, I had him in as the number 4 starter when we started the offseason. Then the Orioles signed two veterans, Tomoyuki Sugano and Charlie Morton, to major league deals. And all of a sudden, Povich is no longer a projected starter for me. I look at it as Eflin, Rodriguez, Morton, Kramer, Sugano as the top five, with Povich and Albert Suarez being the number 6 and 7 for this rotation, however you want to slice it at that point. And we still want the Orioles to trade for a top of the rotation starter. If they do, they might include a young starter, maybe even someone like Cade Povich. If they make that trade and don't include a young arm, Povich could be pushed down as far as 8 in the pecking order. Right now, I would probably say rotation depth 1 through 10, guys you think you might need this year. Eflin, Rodriguez, Kramer, Morton, Sugano, Povich, Suarez, Trevor Rogers, Chase McDermott, Brandon Young would be my 1 through 10 right now. So at best, he's the number 6, and you could put him at number 7. You could absolutely say that Albert Suarez should be ahead of Cade Povich right now. And he could fall as low as number 8 if the Orioles make another addition. Now, I'm not saying he's out of a chance to win a rotation spot. Like, if you go into spring training as the number 6 starter, you could absolutely end up in the top 5 by the time opening day swings around, whether it's good performance, whether it's injuries. We know how many pitching injuries pop up if somebody gets hurt ahead of him. If the Orioles do not make another move and Sugano, Morton, Kramer, Rodriguez, Eflin, someone gets hurt in spring, Povich to me is the guy who slots into the number 5 role and still has a rotation spot. But if the Orioles are healthy, I do think if this whole pitching staff stays healthy, I think Cade Povich will begin the year back down in AAA Norfolk. And it's not because of anything he did wrong. It's just because of how this team shapes out right now. Again, you'd have a rotation of Eflin, Rodriguez, Kramer, Morton, and Sugano as your 5. Then you look in the bullpen and you've got your Bautistas and Canoes, and you add your Andrew Kittredge, and you've got Gregory Soto and Sir Anthony Dominguez and Cionel Perez, and I think Keegan Aiken has a spot, and then you have a spot for a long reliever, so maybe that's Povich, but at that point, you're probably putting Albert Suarez in that role because he has had more success last year. He worked as a reliever and a starter last season, and Suarez is out of options, so if you didn't put him on the opening day roster, he'd go on waivers and someone would snatch him up immediately, whereas Povich has options. So you can just send him back to Norfolk to begin the year. And right now, unless there's an injury, I think Povich would be the first pitcher to get squeezed out and go to Norfolk. Now, again, it's a lot to say if there's not an injury, because we know the devastating Mike Elias first press conference when pitchers and catchers report, when he talks about the injuries that happened over the offseason. There's bound to be at least one of the projected 13 opening day roster pitchers who has something going on and won't be ready for opening day. And whether it's a reliever or a starter, that's where Povich can kind of sneak into an opening day roster spot. And maybe it is a bullpen spot and he can show that he can work in that role as well to help the Orioles this year. But even if the O's are healthy and Povich does have to go to AAA, there's still some things for him to work on. 16 big league starts. He can still work on some things. He's not perfect. But what I will say is you need depth. I've talked about it. The Orioles used 12 starting pitchers last year. They felt perfectly healthy in 2023, and they still used 8 starters. You're targeting using about 10 starters every single season. The fact that Povich is number 6 and at worst number 7 in the pecking order right now tells me the O's are going to use him as a starting pitcher. I mean, I'm going to easily say Povich makes at least 10 starts for the O's in 2025. Now, it could be 20. It could be just 10. We don't really know. That depends on injuries and performance and a lot of stuff we can't see yet here in mid-January. But even if he's not on the opening day roster, don't get down about Cade Povich. He is still going to be a factor. It's just that the O's, they upped the floor of the back end of the rotation with guys like Morton and Sugano and even a guy like Albert Suarez. You just know a little bit more about what you're going to get than with a 24, 25-year-old Cade Povich who's made only 16 big league starts, and it gives you a floor. And here's the thing, right? Sugano could really struggle early. They might have to move him to the bullpen. Maybe Povich gets a role there. Or because Sugano is used to a 6-man rotation in Japan, maybe the Orioles go with a 6-man rotation early in the year. That's a possibility. That would leave maybe a little more of an opening for Cade Povich to get a 6th role for a bit and kind of show what he can do. All of those things are kind of up for grabs. Now, I don't think there's really a bullpen spot up for grabs for Povich. Again, you could say, could he outpitch Keegan Aiken Maybe because Aiken does have options. You could give Povich a spot and send Aiken to AAA, but Aiken was just so good in relief last year. I feel like he's got a spot mostly locked up. And again, just with Suarez being out of options and Povich having them, I can't see them DFAing Albert Suarez to make Cade Povich their long reliever. That's not smart roster management going into the year with how important Suarez was for this team last year. But those are the two openings, I think. It's either an injury or him just severely outperforming Keegan Aiken in a relief role. And that is possible. But I do think for Povich, even if that opening came, I feel like it's better for the Orioles long-term that they stick with Keegan Aiken in that role and they do put Povich in AAA as a starter, because I'm not saying he can't switch between a starter and a relief role throughout the season. He might have to do it, and I think he could do it. But I think it's better for his development to just stay on a starter's routine all year, because yeah, it might mean he gets 8 or 9, 10 starts for the Orioles all season, spends a good chunk of the year in AAA, and that's it. But remember, as I've talked about, the Orioles lose potentially Eflin, Sugano, and Morton from this rotation after 2025, and that's without any injuries that could pop up. And again, this is major league pitchers. Those elbows are fragile. Something else could happen, and you're still, waiting on Bradish and Wells back from Tommy John surgery as well. There's a lot of openings in this rotation right now set for 2026, and if you project the 2026 rotation right now, I'm putting Cade Povich in it if I'm projecting the top 5 for 2026, just with what the Orioles have right now and what will be gone after this season. So keeping him on that starter role and getting him ready for next year, where maybe you do need 25 plus starts out of Cade Povich in 2026, I think that will make him better ready for it. But again, that's only if the O's are healthy and set above him. What's nice to know about him being depth is he is a young pitcher in AAA, but he's already started 16 big league games and had success in the final month of the season. So instead of where the O's were last year, where it was like, okay, Cade Povich is our depth, but we have no idea what we're going to get out of him at this point. Now you know. So when someone does get injured and Povich is the first name you turn to, you can feel confident with him coming up there and immediately being able to slot in and give you a chance to win ball games. And that is why moves like bringing in Sugano and Morton, even with guys like Povich and McDermott and others, Trevor Rogers in the fold, makes the Orioles so much better. Because Povich, instead of it being thrown on him like, all right, boom, it's go time, you're in the rotation, you can have a guy with those 16 starts be your depth. In the previous part of this, your depth would have been Trevor Rogers, which we have no idea about that right now, and Chase McDermott, who's made one major league start. Now your depth is Cade Povich, who you know a lot better, and it's depth you're going to have to turn to. I know the Sugano and Morton moves didn't big time up the ceiling, but it upped the floor, and I think it put Povich in a more comfortable position heading into the season where he will still absolutely help the Orioles win baseball games, but there won't be nearly as much pressure on a guy who's only made 16 big league starts, and I think it's the perfect middle ground for him to be really ready to break out with a real spot in this Orioles rotation in 2026. He may not be around by then. I think there's still a chance that if the Orioles want to go after an ace and a team wants a young starter, Cade Povich could be in that mix, certainly, of guys they would trade away in that deal. But I would, unless it's the piece that gets you over the hump to get a Pablo Lopez or get a Dylan Cease, I feel good holding on to Cade Povich. I think there's big things coming up in his future with the Orioles. But let me know in the comments here in the Locked On Orioles YouTube page. Let me know, what do you think Cade Povich's role will be in 2026? And try to make the prediction. How many starts will Cade Povich make for the Orioles in 2025? Let me know in the comments here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube page. That'll do it for today and most likely for this week, and let me get some bigger Orioles news. If we don't, go Ravens. Hopefully they can get to the AFC Championship game, and I'll be back on Monday with a new episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.